Good. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this sectional presentation for the 2021 Annual Conference of the Hymn Society, United States and Canada. The title of today's session is one that I am really looking forward to hearing about, and that is Hardcore Hymnody, and it's a lecture recital being presented today by Nathan Myrick and Marcell Silva Steuernagel. We're grateful to both of them today for being with us. Nate is an ethnomusicologist and a theological ethicist, assistant professor of church music at Mercer University. And Marcell is assistant professor of church music and director of the Master of Sacred Music program at Southern Methodist University's Perkins School of Theology. So they are really quite prominent in their field, but I think we're going to get to see something a lot more fun today in this presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to them, and I hope you enjoy today's session.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks to everybody who's here watching or watching this later when it's recorded and sent out that way. Really grateful to the Hymn Society for this opportunity to give this digital, virtual, modified lecture recital such as it is. This has been something that's kind of a fun project for Marcell and I, and it's actually something that kind of was spawned or birthed out of the Hymn Society in Dallas a couple of years ago when Marcell and I were driving around, going to and from the various venues of the conference, and remarked about doing, what would we do if we were to do punk rock hymns? And Marcell kind of jokingly responded, "Oh, it's perfect. It'd be so easy. We'll call it Hardcore Hymnody and subtitle it a lecture recital." And we both kind of paused and went, actually, there's merit to that, scholarly and artistic. I mean, if you favor alliteration such as we do, and whatever else, if you can get past the cheese in the camp of the whole thing, we actually hope it's not that cheesy. We have to acknowledge that there is some cheese involved. I mean, there always is in punk rock. Punk sort of unironically embraces cheese, even while it's being ironic about everything else. So there's this kind of that nature of duplicity, you might say. But we are pretty excited to do this. Marcell, do you want to just kind of kick us off a little bit about how you and I got together in just thinking about music and playing and scholarship and everything like that?
Yeah. Thanks, Nate, and thanks to the Hymn Society for being crazy enough to sponsor this. When we met at Baylor University. Nate and I both moved to Waco to study towards our PhD degrees, and we met each other on the very first day of diagnostic exams. Kind of just nodded across the room. We didn't have time to chat before, but as soon as diagnostics were over, we immediately left for beers and started talking about guitars. It was this meeting that is still not over in a sense. We spent a lot of time in the doctoral office listening to bands, playing music, connecting the dots between popular music, culture, philosophy, church music studies, ethnomusicology. There was this bench outside of the building that we had our office in, where we would sit and kind of talk about culture, watch as students walked by, and talk about higher education. We just this huge mix of things, and we jokingly said that we would put up a sign on our door that said Myrick and Steuernagel, culture critics. And in a sense, that attitude is still how we operate now. And I want to make a disclaimer. Because of our relationship and the kind of work we do together, we're going to conduct this in a very rock and roll sort of way. We're going to riff back and forth. Yep. We are going to improvise. We're not going to read our lecture.
I mean, there might be some bits where we have to read because we can't remember what the heck we were going to say otherwise. But that will be the exception, not the norm, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe as we start, and then I'll pass it over to you, Nate, to talk about Capricorn a little bit.
Sure.
I think we want to be clear about things we're not trying to do, or we're trying not to do, and what we are trying to do, right? Both of us lived through the worship wars in different denominational contexts, and actually in different countries. But one thing we're not trying to do is kind of stoke that fire of stylistic division, or to mock. There is irony involved, but there's a difference between irony as a serious part of vulnerable dialogue and mocking. So we're not trying to stoke that fire. That's behind us. We're trying to open and broaden the range of possibilities and not throw rocks back and forth. What we are trying to do is explore combinations of text, tune, and style in church music in different ways, right? So I've said this repeatedly. Nate has said this. I know this is something that both of us say in the classroom, whereas in the past, hymnology may have been guilty of thinking of congregational music as lyrics, and as long as the lyrics are okay, then we're fine. Contemporary scholarship is very adamant about the fact that musicking and singing as activity, as process, is a bundle of texts that includes the lyrics, but also includes musical style, fashion, production, mediation, all these things. So we're trying to explore combinations here. And we're trying to demonstrate the legitimacy of expressions of church music that, while they do relate to the heritage of, the West and the North, in other words, SATB hymns, right, if you will, they don't ignore the vitality and the legitimacy of pop and rock, which, to be honest, and my students remind me all the time, are pretty old music.
Already old, yeah.
That's dad music.
I know. I hate that. No, that's not true. I don't hear it at all. I think it's hilarious.
Yeah. So we're trying to explore notions of hospitality, inclusivity through performances of style that are open to a wide array of musical experiences. Yeah. So to this end, we came up with a project. Nate.
We did. Okay. I need to tack on two things here because as Marcell was talking, it was like, oh yeah, we need to mention this and this. Which, again, this is the riffing. This is what happens when we just hang out, and y'all just get to be present for it. So you're welcome, or I'm sorry, whichever it is. First of all, I wanted to note that the whole heritage of rock and roll in church music is not as diametrically opposed as we might think. And as a matter of fact, rock and roll is pretty well established that rock and roll is a secularizing move of Pentecostal revivalism. Randall Stevens wrote a book a couple of years ago called
The Devil's Music.
The Devil's Music. And he lays out in, I would say, painstaking historical detail, primary sources that just clearly demonstrate that rock and roll is an outgrowth of Pentecostal worship and Pentecostal worship music, especially the revivalist strand of Pentecostalism. So to say that church music and rock and roll are diametrically opposed is just, well, it may have been true in certain instances and iterations. It's not historically true, and they're not something that arose in separate contexts, but rather they share a common, at least a source at one point. Yeah, I think maybe I won't say the other thing. I don't think it's all that necessary. So anyway, about this project. Yeah. So we originally thought this would be a live in-person thing, that we would go to the Hymn Society, we would play a handful of hymns in a punk rock style. We kind of assemble a band, grab some people, and just do a lecture recital, but do a lecture recital proper punk style, which is obviously fraught with dangers. What happened with the pandemic was that obviously the conference is now virtual, and we're doing everything digitally and online. And this kind of gave us this really great opportunity to do a recording project that we've been talking about wanting to do something recording together. We both love being in the studio and doing that kind of stuff. And this just was the perfect opportunity to do it. And the way that was facilitated was that Mercer University recently reopened the kind of historically famous Capricorn Studios, or Capricorn Sound Studios in downtown Macon, which was where the Allman Brothers recorded, and where bands like Charlie Daniels Band or Leonard Skinner recorded. And it was actually initially started as the home studio for Otis Redding, and it was under construction when Otis died. And so it has this very rich history of rock and roll, but it had fallen into disrepair during the 1990s, the 80s and 90s, really kind of a turbulent time for that in the early 2000s. Mercer acquired it, sold it, reacquired it. It's kind of a long story about that, but they ended up raising enough money to renovate and reopen the studio as both a Grammy-sponsored museum and as a functional working recording studio. And part of it being a Mercer building and a Mercer initiative is that the School of Music at Mercer, where I teach, has an allotment of days that they have access to the studio. They can record there, it's just part of the contract. And so when this project was accepted and then it became a virtual conference, I guess I just applied with the dean to ask if we could use the studio as some of our studio time to record this as part of my research agenda. And David Keith, who's the dean of the School of Music, said, "Yeah, that sounds great. That's kind of a perfect way to use the studio." And so it just fell into our laps. And at this point, I need to make mention of a couple of musicians who played with us on this recording, who are obviously not present today. The first is John Botrell, who is a bass player and a music producer based out of Los Angeles. John is a friend of mine from way back when I lived in LA. He actually helped engineer and mix the last record I did, the Believable Eyes project. And then the other is Marcus Reddick. Marcus Reddick is the drum professor or the percussion professor and the director of percussion studies at Mercer University. And he generously volunteered his expertise and time to just come into the studio and lay down the drum tracks. And he totally did that all in less than a day. Just like we sent him some rough demos, some ideas we were thinking about, talked through different styles, and then we just went to the studio and he did it. So really grateful to both John and Marcus for their assistance and their collaboration on this project. If I didn't mention this, John also did the mixes that we're going to share with you today on these songs. So he also played bass and mixed these projects. So it was pretty impressive feats on both of their behalves. And so we're very grateful for that. Let's see here. What else do I need to say about that, Marcell? What am I missing?
I'm going to share a couple of images and short videos from the recording process.
Yeah.
And, for all y'all who aren't familiar with rock history, Capricorn is a mecca, if you will.
One of the 5 most famous recording studios.
So I'm just going to... So you'll see the purpose-built API mixer console.
Right.
But they kept the room pretty vintage, the way it was back there. There's the guitar and amp room. So we had a wide selection of toys to play with.
Yeah. I was just saying about that API too. As Marcell said, it's purpose-built, but it was purpose-built based on the original API that was in the recording studio. So it is able to capture both the analog appeal of what was originally in the room, but also combine it with up-to-date digital technology so that you can use Pro Tools or Logic or whatever other sort of digital mixing software you might have. But what's cool about it is that you don't really need to do much to the audio when it comes off the board because of the fidelity to what it was in terms of the sound. So you still get the sound of Capricorn just onto your Pro Tools, whereas previously you might have to spend a lot of time trying to mix that out.
This is Otis Redding's original piano right there.
Yep, which is really cool. Studio B, kind of a lounge or an alternate recording space. I sometimes teach my understanding rock and roll class in Capricorn when the studio is available. We'll have like special field trip days and we'll do a lecture down there. There's Rob Evans. He's the manager of the studio and the head engineer there. He's a wonderful man to work with. So
great guy. And the sound he gets from that API.
Yes.
So you see a little walkthrough here.
With my orange. Hi, buddy.
You got Nate. He's working on some guitar parts. In the back, you saw Marcus and I kind of putting things together with drums and bass as we prepared to record.
Note the very punk haircut I had there.
Let me move forward here a little bit just to get the ball rolling. So, Rob working on the mix as we were recording. Being able to produce on this desk was one of the great joys for me. It just sounds so good. So you can see I have a fetish with it by the fact that I kept recording videos of us basically just recording. Great set of keyboards, vintage stuff, organs, a Rhodes, a Mark. There's a percussion section. We were like pretty much kids in a toy store.
Oh yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
I saw Adam Tice ask about API. API is the name of a brand. It's a brand name. It can generically refer to audio programming interface, but that's not actually what API product stands for. I don't know what the acronym for the company is. Anyway, not to derail us.
So maybe before we share the songs, a little bit about the sound that we're going for, or the sonic universe that we were working in. So if you take, I want you to think about three words: punk, new wave, and rock, right? So rock is this kind of, or pop rock, if you want to use an even broader term, as this overall encompassing umbrella term that we use for a wide variety of styles, and for a wide variety of attitudes towards music and towards society. Right, those things are very connected in that world. Within that, there are two subsets, maybe three, that we're exploring in more detail. The first is punk, as this nonconformist aesthetic and social critique that started in the early 70s, and that developed, and it informed pretty much everything that came after in terms of rock. One particular expression, this is the second one that we're focusing in, is new wave. And you can think of new wave almost as punk 2.0. So from 70s to the 80s, the incorporation of electronica, and in the case of new wave, the highlighting of electronic elements in music, like drum machines, square wave keyboard sounds, things that you'll hear from Joy Division, for example, and David Bowie have that new wave aesthetic to them, whereas earlier punk rock, even because of the technology, is much more, live band, heavy, gritty, snarly guitars, very fluid tempos, because you really are reacting to the audience and to the mosh pit. And then finally hardcore, as an already established genre that kind of inherits that lineage, and then develops it into all these other subsets that we're not going to go into here. But Nate, I know you want to detail that a little bit more.
Yeah, I want to give it a little bit of detail. So this is part of a course that I teach at Mercer called Understanding Rock and Roll. And one of the things that's really interesting about punk is that punk was never, originally punk happened in New York City, and it wasn't a style at all. It was an attitude. It was a way of rebelling against the really dysfunctional social conditions that were going on in New York City in the mid-1970s. Those of you who may have lived there remember the city was broke. Trash collection wasn't even happening. There was, major power outages, the brownout that sort of is living on in the memory of New York City. And there were a number of musicians on the Lower East Side that just sort of reacted to that and kind of formed their own little circle. People like Patti Smith and the New York Dolls, but also the Ramones and some more famous punk bands. Blondie was a part of that. And so it wasn't a sound, it was an attitude. But what happened that made punk blow up was the Sex Pistols in London. And Malcolm McLaren had managed the New York Dolls for a little while in 1974. And had experienced the attitude and the aesthetic of, say, the New York Dolls, who were cross-dressing rock and roll kind of glam rock musicians, affiliated with the punk scene, but certainly not what we would consider a punk soundscape now. And McLaren took that idea, went back to the UK, enlisted a bunch of musicians and some not musicians, John Linden, aka Johnny Rotten, who's not a musician, and he formed this band called the Sex Pistols. And the Sex Pistols were, first of all, they're not really a band. They were more of a marketing stunt. And the marketing stunt was originally supposed to be sort of a front for McLaren's fashion boutique in London that was called Sex. That was the name of the fashion boutique, which we would now consider to be punk fashion. But at the time, this was just trying to be fashion. And so the Sex Pistols were obviously Sex Pistols. The joke was there. And that was how it started. But then the music kind of came along with it and overtook the fashion in a certain capacity, even though the fashion was always a part of it. So the Sex Pistols were this band that blew up the idea of punk and what punk should sound like. And so all of a sudden you had all these other bands that sounded kind of similar that were then becoming associated with punk. So the Clash was a kind of a classic example of that. And they really rapidly, from the late 1970s to 1980, even by 1978, the Clash had abandoned the punk sound altogether and had started doing what we now call new wave, which Marcell was just referencing. Joy Division is a great example of sort of what new wave became, which is a much more polished, aesthetically accessible version of punk that retains a certain kind of attitude and posture towards society and culture. On the one hand, in the case of the Clash, very much a social commentary and critique. On the hand of Joy Division and some of the other bands, very much an aesthetic, very much a personal thing. Even though Joy Division had some dysfunction internally, notably Ian Curtis's epilepsy and seizures and his consequent suicide. So new wave is kind of emerged out of punk from the glamour side, but the sonic aesthetic of punk, the Ramones, the Sex Pistols, that very gritty, distorted soundscape that Marcell was referencing, took on a life of its own in hardcore. And hardcore emerged, first of all, in the Washington, D.C. area, and then rapidly, almost immediately, in Southern California, both based on interactions with the Ramones shows. And so the Ramones kind of get the credit for starting hardcore, even though the sound evolved beyond them. So hardcore essentially took the speed and aggressive nature of the Ramones with their distorted guitars, their really short, simple songs, and doubled down on it, made it louder, made it faster, made it heavier, made it more aggressive, made it more, more confrontational. And what's really interesting about it is that hardcore quickly developed several different strands of ethics. So in the DC scene, there was straight edge. Straight edge was no illicit sex, no alcohol, no tobacco use. And so it was characterized by black X on the back of your wrist, and then it was stylized with the X in the middle and S and E for straight edge. But the X came from all ages shows that were at a bar where they would mark your wrist with a black X and say you're underage, you can't, don't serve this person alcohol. So people started adopting that black X as a moniker to say, I'm choosing to live by this lifestyle. And what's interesting about straight edge is that straight edge opened the door for other forms of moral commitments to become a part of punk rock. Notably, eventually, actually rather rapidly, the Christian hardcore movement and Christian, it's called spirit-filled hardcore. As early as 1984, the band The Crucified was making a big splash out in basically the middle Central Valley of California. And then there were a bunch of other Christian hardcore and punk bands that emerged. So even within 4 or 5 years of the explosion, if you will, of punk music, there were Christian punks. There was a Christian punk scene even in California. So just to give a little history lesson there. So if you just remember, new wave is more of the sort of popular aesthetic, the less confrontational. This is the David Bowie, the U2, all those bands. And then hardcore is more of what you would think of with the sound of punk. That would be Fear or X or Minor Threat or Bad Brains or these kind of bands. This is the hardcore sound. Anyway.
And whereas this is one of the first spots where irony really shines in this lecture recital, because while some of us I would maybe even venture to say that many of us in the church were primed within in that idea of a sacred secular divide, and you listen to this but you don't listen to that, and these repertoires and histories don't have any communication. We Nate mentioned before Randall Stevens' book, which is great. There is a non-conformist DNA that is shared, right? And that kind of it converges into straight edge, whereas the same kind of anti-establishment, non-conformist attitude that is present throughout the history, especially the history of the church, especially since the Reformations, just finds a natural harbor in this attitude.
Right.
So whereas some of us, again, may have grown up thinking that these were absolutely separate worlds, in fact, there's so much cultural, theological grafting that is happening here that is fascinating, especially in light of the songs that we chose, which come from a lot of them are from Baptist traditions and not nonconformist traditions. But we do associate them nowadays with church establishment, right? So, Nate, you want to go on to the music?
Yeah, let's listen to the music. We've yammered on long enough here. So we're going to share with you some of the recordings. We've got 3 songs we're going to share with you today. The first is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. And we'll play it for you, and then we'll discuss it a little bit. So here we go. Manage your sound. back it up. So we're just testing it.
Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing thy grace, streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of loudest praise, teach me some melodious sonnet sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of thy redeeming love. Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I come, and I hope by thy good pleasure safely to arrive at home. Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger, interposed with precious blood. Oh, to grace, how great a debtor daily I'm constrained to be. Let thy goodness, like a fetter, bind my wandering heart to thee. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above. Here's my heart, Lord, take and seal it for thy courts above.
So a couple things to say about that arrangement of Nettleton and Come Thou Fount. First of all, obviously Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing by Robert Robinson, written in 1758. He's a Methodist minister who was eventually, mostly after his lifetime, accused of becoming a Unitarian later in life. And that's mainly, in some ways that's been refuted because he was actually on his desk at the time of his death was actually a pamphlet refuting Unitarian theology. He was working on writing it. So there's a lot of apocryphal stories about Robinson that go around, mainly, well, I shouldn't say mainly, possibly because of a reality, but probably more likely because of the B section of the third stanza, that prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, prone to leave the God I love. This very honest and sort of vulnerable confession of doubt or of weakness or of just uncertainty or maybe even faltering faith. There's actually a really interesting apocryphal story that's repeated enough to sort of suggest that there is a journal or a kernel of truth in it, that towards the end of his life, Robinson was riding in a carriage with a few other people in England, and the young woman in the carriage was holding forth about spirituality and religious convictions and things like that, and she actually quoted Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, one of the lines in it, to Robinson, to which he responded, again, allegedly, "Ma'am, I am the unfortunate soul who penned those lyrics, and I wish to God every day that I had never written them." So this is the sort of the mythology that lives around and surrounds Come Thou Fount, which kind of explains some of the popular uses of the tune. Even though it squarely belongs to the canon of Western hymnody, it's also used quite a lot in just regular old popular folk music, or even just popular religiosity. The song has been covered by dozens of rock bands, including like Mumford and Sons from like the indie folk movement and things like that. So there's a lot of resonance there. And I will say that the song has sort of haunted me as well. I know I've written in the hymn society, or the hymn before, that the song sort of, it sticks in my brain. It kind of follows me around. So that's part of why I wanted to do the song, for both the cultural resonance reasons, but also just on a personal note, it's probably my favorite hymn. About the arrangement, we obviously stuck with Nettleton. I had originally thought we would do it in 3/4, but I wanted to keep the really tight closed quarter note, or I guess eighth note hi-hat, and the down strum on the electric guitar. And then we realized that we just needed to move it to 4/4 to really keep that feel. Otherwise, it swung a little bit too much, and just it got more into what we would now know as ska, although it would have been two-tone back in the 80s. But we wanted to keep it very clearly in that straight down the middle of pop to punk sort of soundscape. But the poetic meter, obviously still 8/7. You can still do all of the normal harmonies to it. Well, mostly the normal harmonies. So a few bits that we took some liberties with, as we are wont to do. Yes, so the other things about like the historical integration of punk that the song is trying to sort of display. First of all, the introduction is a nod to the pop punk and what we now call easycore of the late 1990s, early 2000s bands like Jimmy Eat World or Newfound Glory or those kinds of things. Yeah. And then we sort of brought some other elements in that were present in that, but we sort of wanted to highlight them. So one of those is the straight downstrokes on the clean electric guitar playing the 16ths. That is definitely a very intentional nod to the Ramones, to Johnny Ramone, the guitarist, who basically said, "I only strum one direction." And this is both rhetorical, but also there's an aesthetic that comes out of just only playing downstrokes on the guitar. So it kept that in the clean electric guitar, which is kind of I guess present throughout the entirety of the song. And then, but doing it with a clean guitar, the Ramones would do it with electric. Doing it clean was more of a nod to the Clash and that new wave soundscape as well. And then as the song builds, we have a terrace dynamic effect throughout. And once we get to the first bridge, Marcell's guitar, the sort of I guess it's an alternating you're missing the fourth, the downstroke on the fourth, right? That pattern. Yep. So yeah. It's a staccato pattern, but it actually indexes a lot more of the pop punk aesthetics from the early 2000s. And so we're able to sort of highlight how those two things are very compatible. Two final things. One is the synth bass and the lead bass line for the final stanza and refrain that we used, which is also, again, a feature of new wave, the synth bass, and what became known as post-punk, with the lead bass line, the bass following the melody and doubling it in a few places. And then the second bridge is definitely where we move towards hardcore or post-hardcore, with the harmonic guitar parts and the sort of spaced out. It's almost a polyphony, but it's not quite there. Or counterpoint, I mean, not polyphony, it's almost counterpoint. Doesn't quite get there, but we're sort of playing with those sorts of ideas, which came out later in hardcore, into post-hardcore in bands like Fugazi or, as I mentioned earlier, Bad Brains. So there's the quick background on what we did there with Come Thou Fount. Anything you want to add to that, Marcell? What did I miss?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive. One thing that I might want to say is that you hear the arrangement, it's like, oh, you planned this all out in advance. But part of what we wanted to do in the studio was to have a couple of rough ideas and an intention, get in there, riff back and forth. And this is, Nate mentioned the 3/4 transition. And I think this was one of those cases where we just started playing the song and it takes you in certain aesthetic directions. So we just went with it.
I should also mention the vocal delivery. Obviously, I'm not the greatest singer in the world, so I'm just gonna, put that out there, name it what it is, and y'all can agree. And you don't have to feel like you have to say it or not say it. But one of the things that is a hallmark of punk is amateurism. Like there is an ethic of amateurism in punk rock, and so not singing well is actually not just accepted; it's expected. Like this is what a punk singer is supposed to sound like. I'm not saying that I sound like that, but I'm saying that an amateur voice, sort of a sneery delivery, a little bit of this sort of pitchiness, aiming for affect over pitch and tone or intonation is more important. And this is what punk sounds like. This is how you do punk. If you're really intent on making your pitch, bel canto and everything else, you're not doing punk. You're doing it wrong at that point. You'll notice that there are parts where Marcell's and my voice are not quite in tune. I'm thinking that's probably me, and we just chose not to pitch correct that because that's not what you do for punk. So anyway,
absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Nate. Can we listen to
Yes,
My Hope Is Built, and then we'll talk about that a little bit.
Nope. Got it.
Hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. When darkness fills his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the field. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. His surface covenant, his blood, support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. When he shall come with trumpet sound, oh may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand.
Thanks, Nate.
Yeah, man.
So a couple of things about this arrangement. So My Hope Is Built on Nothing Less, Edward Mote, 1834. He's a guy who grew up without any religious training, without any religious training, and became a Baptist minister later in life. The tune, We Stuck with Solid Rock, 1863. William Bradbury, one of the heavy hitters of hymnody of that era, right? And the idea here was to go with a case study in what happens after, right? So if we talked about, Nate walked us through that history of a very nonconformist, anti-establishment, in the case of New Wave, anti-corporate ethos that then unwittingly becomes part of what the music industry does, right? And all that polishing that happens and the incorporation into the sounds of, various pop artists. But as these stylistic markers fuse and merge into new musical expressions, they become more polished, more palatable, more accessible to a wider audience. So you could rephrase that question as, what happens when U2, whose band members very much grew up on punk and new wave, popify those influences for a new audience, for a younger audience, for an international audience, right? This dynamic is something you can find in the history of pop rock kind of across the board. A great example that I like to cite in classroom is Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana, right? So 1991, from Nevermind, their iconic album. It's a classic. It's a classic. And Butch Vig, who was producing that album, had originally mixed Smells Like Teen Spirit under a very punk aesthetic. It was raw, it was dry, and it was in your face. And if you read various histories there, basically Vig, the band, and the record executives at DGC were not happy with the mix, and he said, we're gonna remix this. They went with Andy Wallace. He had a good track record of working with bands such as Slayer, and they called Andy Wallace in to mix that. And his mix is almost like a popified punk 2.0 mix, because there's a healthy dose of effects. There's reverb, there's chorus, there are delays in the background. Overall, it's a much more polished take on Smells Like Teen Spirit, right? So you try to keep that underlying layer of punkiness, of hardcoreishness. I don't know what the correct terms for those things are, but you add to it and you incorporate these new influences. So you'll hear things that like that hemiola in the intro and the interludes, where we're obviously layering 3/4 over 6/8, and that's an influence that has hugely shaped North American Christian congregational singing, especially through U2 and then Coldplay. That's what a lot of contemporary Christian music nowadays sounds like. So again, irony shows up because there's a strong connection to this punk, new wave, hardcore heritage that makes its way into what people sing in church on Sunday morning. But we wanted to keep some of that early sound in there, and you get that in the vocal delivery, which Nate has talked about. So we approached it with the same strategy. There's not a ton of pitch correcting, and when you hear us both singing, you hear us kind of scream singing, weaving in and out, and that's what we want to do. So you're not supposed to make breathe at the same. This is not choral music. Right. You're expected to be kind of weave. It's a dance. It's a different kind of dance.
Gang vocals. In punk terminology, it's called gang vocals.
Gang vocals, yeah. So they don't layer prettily as a 1980s praise and worship song. You're not going to get your majesty. This.
Even though it isn't cutouts,
Instead, they're just like kind of stumbling over each other, gang vocaling it, and that we try to create a contrast between some of those elements, and then you revert to the big open space of the interludes with da na 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 na, and that's almost like that anti-solo guitar hook with the big reverb and what we would call arena rock, right, which is what U2 made famous. And then the tight chunkiness of the stanzas, where again you get those elements that Nate mentioned with the tung, 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 right, the percussive guitar, and the drier vocals. As the arrangement progresses, it becomes increasingly more hardcore-ish and less popish. One example of that is the doubling of the drum part, right, which becomes so you get that like aggressive staccato effect, which is compiled by the guitar, the bass, and the drums, and just gives more energy to the arrangement and to the song until it finally opens up for that last outro, which is simply a repetition of what we just did.
Yeah, and where you see that in popular music is the trajectory from grunge and alternative in the early 1990s through the Foo Fighters and into things the Stone Age, and then now just sort of into just general active rock on the radio. So
yeah. And so when you listen to contemporary acts like, but Foo Fighters right now are pretty old school. They're OG, right?
yeah,
But
OG.
like Muse, for example, which takes some of that heritage and re-signifies it for a new audience. These processes are constantly happening.
Is Muse still like current? I feel like they're old too. I mean,
Yeah,
we're
they
old.
are. They
We've
are.
already established that we're old.
All our references are from previous eras.
They're Gen X references. We've got Gen X references all over us right now, Marcell. Gosh,
what you gonna do?
somebody save us. Okay.
Shall we gather?
Shall we gather? Shall we?
I don't know. We'll see.
Very rhetorical here. All right.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angel feet have trod, with its crystal tide forever flowing by the throne of God? Shall we gather at the river, the beautiful, beautiful river? Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God. On the margin of the river, washing up its silver spray, soon we'll reach the shining river. Soon our pilgrimage will cease. Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Shall we gather at the river, the beautiful, beautiful river? Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of God.
So, shall we gather at the river? is obviously a standard of the American Baptist hymnody and repertory, but it has a very profound cultural life in America, being written in 1864 at the height of the Civil War, the bloodiest year in American history up to then and up until World War II. I guess actually until pandemic this year. And there's just such a stark sense of questioning and sadness and sort of just uncertainty to the piece. And one of the things that we did right off the bat was, well, I shouldn't say right off the bat, it took a lot of deliberation, but we changed the lyrics. And I mean, forgive us, man, please don't crucify us. But we changed the refrain from "yes, we'll gather." We just kept the "shall we gather." And I'm kind of skipping ahead in our notes here, Marcell. You have to forgive me. We'll improvise later. But there's just something very necessary about keeping that question open right now. I mean, as of right now, I think there's 3.7 million deaths from the pandemic. There are a lot of people who are missing, who are not here, and we who are alive and remain are asking that question: shall we gather? And yeah, we can have some confidence and certainty, but there's also something really important about letting the question hang open for a little while. Something that's always bothered me about "shall we gather" is that it goes right to "yes, we'll gather" in the first chorus, which is literally the American pop trope of "get to the chorus already," and there's something about that really bothered me. And so we've kept that open for this as a space. I was actually just in another session at the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship, the Vital Worship Grants program, where Julie Ty said something to the effect that sometimes we don't need more things to say. Actually, we don't have anything else to say. We just need space to think and space to feel. We have a lot of things that we're trying to engage and wrestle with. And so we tried to leave that space open. And so that's one of the benefits, I think, of this particular style of music, of punk rock and hardcore. We also changed the lyrics for a couple of reasons, mostly just aesthetic, but also just practical. We elided stanza 3 and stanza 4 into just the third stanza. Took the first line of stanza 3 and then transitioned to stanza 4. It still works very well. It just, having 5 stanzas made the song too long for one, but also it kind of lost a little bit of the rhetorical effect of the way we have it arranged, at least in our opinion, or mine maybe. Marcell, you don't have to share every opinion I have, I guess. But so just to give a little more of the reference on what the music is doing in terms of the relationship between punk and hardcore, it definitely takes the cue from the sort of hardcore and post-hardcore bands like Fugazi I mentioned earlier, but also the Dead Kennedys, who are sort of they are the reason there are those parental advisory stickers on CDs that have more than 4 F words in them. And so the Dead Kennedys have a lot of cultural panache, if you will, within hardcore music. They're kind of famous in that scene. What it also does is blend some of what we now call emo, but was originally the emotional hardcore of bands like Rites of Spring, and then later a little more popularly At the Drive-In. And so the song does kind of move from that stark sense of loneliness at the beginning as the question is posed in light of the pandemic to the outbursts, if you will, of the second and third refrains. And then through the kind of the suffocating accelerando of the bridge and I guess the final chorus, and no, not the final chorus, the third refrain, and then the bridge, and then kind of the quiet sincerity of the final stanza and refrain. And I mean, in terms of delivery, I dropped the punk sneer for that. I wanted to convey some sincerity there. Not that sincerity is absent from punk, but it's indexed, or rather is configured differently. It's configured in the sneer as an authenticity to oneself over and above something else, whether that's in opposition to the lyrics or the theme that's being addressed, or if it's in opposition to something that seems to be connected in a meaningful way outside of the lyrics, but to the culture and the connotation. So an example of that from when we were recording was Marcell and I were back at my house here after the first or second day in the studio, and we were just doing YouTube videos on the TV, just kind of unwinding. And we found a concert from the Dead Kennedys in somewhere in the Bay Area in 1983, I guess. And in the middle of the concert, they stop, and East Bay Ray, who's the guitar player, was the guitar player or the bassist, I can't remember who it was, but starts playing Rock of Ages Cleft for Me on the bass in this very Baptist revival altar call. And Jello Biafra, the lead singer, I'm not even sure what his real name is, Eric something or other. He's deliberately ambiguous about it. But anyway, Jello puts on this Ronald Reagan mask and gives this very, very sarcastic, sardonic altar call that just really lampoons the conflation of Reagan era capitalism and moral majority Christianity. And it's this really vivid, visceral moment of cultural critique because of the sincerity of the accompaniment. It's done completely unironically, and then Biafra is just over the top irony and sarcasm and critique. So it's this difficult thing to watch as a church musician. We'll be completely honest, but I think there's something very important that we have to learn from that as church musicians. Not that we need to do punk rock, but that there are valid critiques, and that punk rock functions as a vehicle for those valid critiques. Yeah, Marcell, you're gesticulating at me.
Yeah, I mean, that's perfect. We have, before we kind of wrap this, I'm gonna dovetail into that, Nate. We have about 15 minutes left. Want to make sure we wrap this up and address a couple questions. But in that sense, these expressions, these musical aesthetics, if you will, they're hospitable to certain aspects of the human experience that perhaps other aesthetics aren't. Sometimes you don't want a resolution. Sometimes you don't want an authentic cadence. Sometimes you don't want 4-part harmony. Sometimes you don't want pretty melodies. Sometimes you want to rant. You want to kick doors in. And so in a sense, these what we're exploring is a little bit resonates with something that you find in the Psalms. Some sections of the major and minor prophets where frustration is the letter of the day. And there really is no bow tying everything together, right? Shall we gather? And we don't, in this lecture recital, we don't want to degenerate or hijack any hymns from the so-called canon of Western hymnody, because as we learned through the worship wars, and we continue to experience that through the aggressive polarization of our denominational, social, political discourses today, that these discourses of violent separation, and they don't help us identify opportunities for dialogue or for broadening the experience of singing faith. Instead, they create these rhetorical and conceptual blind spots that exacerbate how we diminish and dismiss and otherwise erase those uncomfortable others from our experience of the music of the church. So we're trying to do the opposite of that. In fact, I have a document called The Angry Underbelly of Church Music Literature that's ongoing. So I collect like nasty vitriolic tidbits of these rhetorics, and I'm accepting contributions if you have any of those. What we're doing instead, think of it in terms of food. We're broadening the palate, right? There are many ways to prepare a dish. These ways vary from place to place depending on what ingredients you can find, what is fresh and what is not. So we're preparing a well-known dish with different spices. And in doing so, we want to demonstrate that we can continue to enjoy this heritage in many different ways as we expand our hospitality towards aspects of the human experience and groups of people that have traditionally or frequently, I would say, been excluded from our more polished experiences of congregational singing. Nate, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one quick thing, then we'll open it up for questions. Is just that there are so many things that have just been laid bare in the last year and a half in American society. I mean, you can see the trajectory going back for decades, but the big issues of inequality, of systemic racism, of just the sort of socioeconomic injustices and everything else have just really been brought to the front, and people are justifiably mad at God. And I'm not trying to hold court on God here. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I want to say that I mean, when you have a global pandemic and 3.7 million people die, and then a third of the population is denying that, there's real anger there. And the Psalms, the imprecatory Psalms especially, have a really great template for that. And I'm just going to hazard a guess that when the Israelites were singing those songs, they weren't singing it bel canto at SATB. There was probably something a little edgy, a little aggressive in that section of the psalmody that we share as a common heritage. And so I think maybe this kind of music can be a vehicle for that. That this is something that maybe congregational music might need as an option, as another dish at the table of worship. Anyway, questions?
So I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
I was going to say, it's one question that's come in so far, and I invite anybody else to kind of write them into the chat if you'd like to have something raised. But Andreas Teisch from Bay City, Michigan asks, this style appears to be more oriented toward performance than congregational singing, or am I just showing my age?
Andreas, I'm happy to get us started here. That's a great question. I do think part of the rhetoric or the way the framework that we've learned to use to decide what is congregational and what is not is tied to that worship war history that we talked about before. And one of the criteria that was used back and forth was a criteria of singability, of what lies at the presentational versus the participational end of the music-making spectrum, right? I think in the end, congregational is what is sung by the congregation. You look at church music through history and geographically nowadays. If you ask me to participate in a Hindustani service, I'm not going to make it. If you ask me to participate, to be honest, I remember being in the classroom with a student from Ghana. Right, I'm a composer. I've studied years and years to be able to do this thing, and this student started tapping polyrhythm on one hand, and I was lost. And for him, it was the simplest thing in the world. It was like, pre-K level polyrhythm. And I was like, oh my God. When Nate mentioned the gang vocals, I think it has to do with that. For a lot of the punk culture, the performing experience is not one of a band that is performing and you buy a ticket and you passively listen to the performance. In fact, if you go to, if you went to CBGB's in New York, you were expected to be a part of the performance. You sing along, you throw cups of beer at the bass player, you dive from the stage into the mosh pit. The borders, the frontiers between what's happening on the stage and in the audience, in the back of the room, the front of the room, between what is presentational and what is participational, all of those things are very diluted, as they should be.
Yeah, and just to speak to that, the fundamental element of a punk rock concert is participation, and that's well established in scholarship, on pop music scholarship, that this is a participatory style of music. Now, not everybody participates the same way, and also participation is different than what we might call participation in traditional Western church music and SATB hymnody. It's a different style of participation. But one of the things that's really a hallmark of punk rock music is the microphone. Let's just pretend it's a microphone, and that the lead singer will just spend about half of the show passing the microphone around to the audience or to the congregation. I'm making an illusion here, but that's actually like an integral part of the live performance is the participation. So much so that one of the hardcore ethoi, I guess, of the 80s and 90s was that you did not perform on a stage. You were on the floor with the rest of the band or the audience or the crowd. So it's called crowd. It's not called audience because you have a crowd that just goes rocking and rolling with it. So there's something very participatory about this. And we also see this kind of making its way into the church with the modern worship phenomenon, where it's loud enough that everybody who's untrained in singing is comfortable to sing along as loudly as they wish, because they're not going to offend their neighbor. And even if they know they can't carry a tune in a bucket, and they certainly can't sing 4-part harmony. So there are elements of both hospitality and exclusion in this. Obviously, this is not an inclusive style of music. This is a style of music that is going to exclude by definition. I mean, the punk authenticity is orientation around exclusion, as in I am not that, I am this over here. And so if you're going to have that sort of apophatic identity, of course it's going to be exclusive to an extent. But within that exclusivity, other people find inclusion. So it's this very complex matrix in terms of participation or congregational nature of it. So that's,
and maybe flipping that on its head a little bit should help us to understand what's exclusionary about our performances of church music, right? And Nate mentioned the SATB thing. And, maybe certain of our performances of church music within the Northern Western canon imply that if you can't sing in a bel canto style, if you can't hold a melody prettily, if you don't have a pretty voice, then you're not authorized to sing. The same thing with language. If I can't speak English, then I can't participate in this kind of transnational experience of Western Christian imperialism. Or in contemporary Christian music, hey, what are octave jumps? Right. So nowadays, a lot of worship songs, if they need that octave jump, who's going to follow that?
Right.
If you're not, if you don't have great range, so how are we excluding it? As we analyze the issue of inclusion and hospitality across the performative presentational spectrum, we are constantly faced with these blind spots that should help us reflect on our own worshiping experience. I think we will always have them with us, to paraphrase Jesus, right?
Those weeds, they're always going to be there.
Yeah.
One other thing I want to say, because I think this is such an important conversation, especially around the theme of hospitality, is that homogeneity will always be exclusive. And that's one of the things that we've wrestled with as Westerners, and I'll say as Americans myself here, is that we haven't quite figured out how to really embody unity and diversity, such that diversity requires difference. And if you're going to be different, then you can't be a part of us. And it's really, like, I say it that way, and that sounds so condemnatory, and it kind of is, except for in real life, that's almost impossible to get around. Because where I go to church, First Baptist Church of Christ, downtown Macon, and we have Stanley Roberts as the choir director. And so it's this very, very traditional organ and choir and, church, very traditional Western hymnody, Westminster style choir. And if we were to try to do something else within that framework, it would be be offensive and exclusive, and we would really have to wrestle with it. And so it's a big open question. What does it mean to be hospitable? And what does it mean to have space for others in our worship, irrespective of styles, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be musical style. It could also be posture or dress or political standing. I mean, all of these kinds of things. It's a really messy question, and it's really difficult to allow space in true diversity, which, and I mean, I'm gonna start preaching here. Somebody give me a soapbox, but there's something really important about what God says in Genesis about, go forth, go be fruitful and multiply, cover the earth. Do not stop in the plain of Shinar where you are going, but to go and be abundant. And the people say, no, we're going to stay here in this plain. We're going to build for ourselves a tower. Let us make for ourselves a tower, and we'll be like God. And there's this great rhetorical thing that happens in there where the name, we'll make a name for ourselves, which is the Hebrew reference for Yahweh, the name, right? And so there's this turn that happens where God comes down and foils by the diversity of language. And we, at least I, as a person who grew up in the evangelical Baptist kind of tradition, was always taught that God's foiling of their language was part of the curse. This was a punishment. But if you look back at what God said beforehand to Noah, and then all the way up through, was that they were supposed to go out and fill the whole earth and multiply, and that the diversity was a critical component of that. And so God's foiling the Tower of Babel through the diversity of language is not a sin or a punishment to be overcome, but rather is God's intention for his creation or their creation to be flourishing, to live, to be diverse. And so it is the difference, sometimes the lack of understanding that enables the fulfillment of God's creation. So I guess I'm speaking a little bit metaphorically and preacherish here, but I think that's a really important thing that we as church musicians and worship leaders should be thinking about.
Can I raise one more question before we end it? We're almost out of time, but I was really struck what you were saying about texts of the imprecatory psalms, the Psalms of Lament, that ranting at God, and you sort of characterized this style of music also as allowing for kicking down doors and ranting. But I was struck at the texts that you chose for these three examples are all kind of sweet, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about the relationship between the texts you chose and musical style.
Well, Nate, you want to start?
I mean, I'll throw the soft toss to you, Marcell, and say it's about the irony of it, right? It's about the sublime confusion of being alive and being a human being. It's that life is both sweet and somewhat terrible at the same time, and if we can't figure out a way to celebrate the abundance of God's life, to flourish and to thrive in the midst of both the sweetness and the terror of what it is to be loved by God, then I guess we're kind of sunk. So that was what was behind it for me. What do you got, Marcell?
Yeah, I tend to resort to food references as my default mode of thought, and I describe that as
I love you.
the sweet and sourness of human experience, right? Where we in church music, I think we have this expectation that pretty should be, or what in the theory of composing for films you would call Mickey Mousing, right? Which is repeating what is being visually translated through the music. So if you see a tugboat, it should sound like a tugboat. If you see a train, you have to have the choo-choos, right? I think in church music, we've come to expect that, pretty should be matched with pretty. And when you put that in the history of the development of the Christian imagination in terms of light and beauty and truth and God, that has, in a sense, limited our sensory perception of what it means to sing our faith from the Christian perspective. So in a sense, these odd pairings are harmonizing by contrast. Just like you can do that with wine, or it's just like I'm going to harmonize this cheese or this seafood with a wine that all the French will go berserk because they're not supposed to do that, but it tastes really good. So that's the way that we're looking at it. Irony in that sense can be a blessing, and that's not something we hear often. It's something we use a lot in interpersonal relationships. So just I'm dovetailing with what Nate put out there.
Okay. Hey, thanks so much. This has been a really, really interesting session. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I'm sure that those who've been watching have enjoyed it too, and those who are about to watch it in the next couple of weeks as well. So thanks everybody for being with us. Thank you, Nate. Thank you, Marcell.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks to Hymn Society.
Take care.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks for having us.